In today's episode, we're diving into a shift that could reshape industries, families, and communities over the coming decades: the pink tsunami, the unprecedented transfer of wealth into the hands of women. My guest is Catherine Gerazio, wealth advisor at CC&L Private Capital, whose 25-year career spans leadership in private capital, a former pro snowboarder, and recognition as one of British Columbia's most influential women in finance. Catherine brings a unique blend of financial acumen, values-based advising, and a passion for education and empowerment. In our conversation, we explore why this wealth shift is happening, how it will influence investment philosophies, philanthropy, and entrepreneurship, and why businesses and advisors must adapt to serve a new generation of values-driven wealth holders. We also unpack the essential conversations families should be having now about wealth stewardship, educating the next generation, and building confidence for women who find themselves newly responsible for significant wealth. This episode is about financial empowerment, long-term thinking, and shaping a more purposeful future with capital. And now a little thing to make the regulators happy. This presentation is made for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by Catherine Gerazio are subject to change at any time. It has been prepared without regard to the particular financial circumstances and objectives of any individual who listens, and nothing in this presentation constitutes or is a substitute for individually tailored financial, legal, tax, or investment advice. And with that, let's dive in. Catherine, I really appreciate you making time to be on the podcast today.
Oh, I'm just thrilled to be here, Mike. Thank you so much.
So, okay, let's talk about waves. There are some waves coming. Actually, I think they're bigger than waves. What do we need to know?
Well, you and I were having lunch, and I think we coined it perfectly as a tsunami. And that's because we have witnessed the impact of what was the silver tsunami, the baby boomer generation, and what came with a transformation of a large cohort of individuals and how they influenced industry from what they bought to how they spent their time, cruise industries, golf industries, etc. And what we see forming and cresting right now is what you and I actually coined as the pink tsunami. You know, here dressed in black, I'm not really the girl in pink, but this makes a lot of sense to me because what we see is an incredible shift in the control of wealth by women that's happening imminently, but even over the next decade. We see a shift in Canada alone of $2.2 trillion of wealth controlled by women today, mounting to $4 trillion in just a few short years. And you take that south of the border of the US and that amounts to 20 trillion. So it's caught an industry and the eyes of individuals, but we're not there and truly understanding it yet.
So, I mean, those are big numbers. And I have to point out the macabre underlying piece of this, which is that clearly women are living longer than men. So as this wealth transfer is a factor of a lot of businesses being sold, wealth being generated, and then the patriarch of the family dying effectively. And the matriarch, in a lot of cases, where in some cases it was actually a female-led business, and so the wealth stayed with women. But the transfer piece of it is that kind of movement from the patriarch to the matriarch as a result of the die-off of maybe the original founder of the business. And so these women that are about to have all this wealth, they're going to apply their value, their values, their investment philosophies, their approach to the world to how they do philanthropy. Is that a fair comment?
It's a completely fair comment, but let's extrapolate it into really two different things that are happening, because there's a transfer of wealth, which starts with the baby boomers, the male statistically being the last to pass away, and therefore, a female becoming responsible for wealth. You also see that then flowing through inheritances that might be to children. And you might also see that amounting from divorce, still 50% or more marriages. So that is the transfer happening in parallel, which is more women, are staying unmarried. You also then see them at an increasing percentage finishing university. And the statistics around them being breadwinners, or at least financial contributors to the family equation, is rising. So you add all of that up, and that's what's amounting to those big numbers. And if you actually take it out to 2045, it's 84 trillion in the US with those two big demographic shifts. But you're right. Women, whether it's investing or spending or saving, apply something different. And I'm just going to say that as values. So we can talk a little bit about that. But ultimately, women are very value oriented. They say, you educate a woman, you educate a family, and she wants to express this with what matters to her. So control of wealth will not only transform the financial industry, we can go there, but also, just how people are going to have to target this audience with what matters to women, whether that's, retail, whether that's healthcare, education, because they're going to direct those dollars in the way that they see is important to them.
I mean, that's got to be driving, a shift in the investment space as well eventually, because it still has been, I think, to today, a more male-dominated industry. And yet the clients are now going to be shifting to more and more women. I think another stat that I heard is around university graduation, that for the first time ever, there are more women graduating from university than there are men. And there are more women getting accepted into universities than men are getting accepted to the same universities. So the shift is partly to do wealth, but then the generation, as you say, through inheritance that's coming up, there are a lot more women entering into the workforce, highly educated women entering into the workforce. That is also going to help to propel and drive this change.
Correct. Yeah, as women are educated, they'll get those higher paying jobs, will have more influence from an organic way within the businesses themselves. For the finance industry, and many others, women were not the target audience.
Right.
I almost say we were an afterthought.
Okay.
We came along with the equation. So
Sure.
whether it was how the business was set up, how the reporting, how the content, how it was delivered to a family was largely oriented to the male patriarch, which, most often than not was the person leading those financial decisions. And that needs to shift. And what's hard about that is that it's a nuanced shift. We are coming at this with different needs and different values, but it's not a black and white of how that's interpreted. I might identify with a woman just because of being much like what we're talking about today, someone who's contributed to their family, is financially interested and now literate, obviously, for what I do. But with that, speaks in a knowing way to other women with what they're feeling or what they're looking for. That is really hard to train. And it's really hard to adapt a huge industry, which is male dominated still, to speak to it. And while the numbers alone make everyone interested to try, I do say you can't just put a banner up and say, okay, women, come on in.
Right.
You really have to connect with them. Things that matter to women really actually isn't whether it's a female representative or a male advising. That seems to be actually statistically different.
Okay.
It becomes that value-oriented connection. So the level of service, are they connecting and respecting both people at the table if we have a spouse involved as well? Is the children and the multi-generational planning being talked about? Because women do want to think about this from a goal orientation. They're much more long-term investing oriented than maybe looking for a stock or a deal or something shorter term in nature. And so with that, just how the conversation unfolds, how the family is involved, how it's spoken to over generations. And as I mentioned, with education and women in a family being important, educating those kids. They want to be see their kids much more responsible for wealth than they likely feel they are themselves.
And so that shift of wealth stewardship towards a different set of values, towards more long-term thinking from an investment perspective, as you say, less about what's the best deal that I can see in the market right now, and more what is in the long-term best interest of the estate and of the family overall, and what does that mean for the children. I'm curious how that then influences their philanthropic decisions, and how is that conversation different when you're having that conversation with a woman versus how maybe men have traditionally looked at philanthropy?
Yeah, so philanthropy, I think, man or woman, again, it comes to what's important to them. So if we try to extrapolate there's probably more classic charitable causes that more women than not would be interested in: education, healthcare, but a certain event in their life or their family may orient them to mental health or something very specific. So I don't know if I will generalize in that, but value-oriented decision-making lends itself to philanthropy. And I think we can just say there is an expectation women will be more philanthropic with the control of wealth than we've seen. So how do we foster that? Well, conversation is then less short-term in nature. What investments do I have? How are they returning? And it becomes much more about what I call the sustainability of their wealth. What can and can't I afford today? How do I make those decisions on a day-to-day basis so that they're empowered to go into their life, be responsible for this wealth, make those decisions, whether it's from the groceries and the Starbucks to the cars choices or other expenses that might be greater than that. And then apply what we call core capital. What do I need in order to make my wealth last the rest of my life?
Right.
And then what would be excess? So can I give that to my children? Can I give that to charitable causes? Can I do something otherwise? And maybe we could segue this into start a business. When women have much more control and independence and wealth, they make great entrepreneurs. Not that men don't make great entrepreneurs, but I think we're going to see an interest in them designing the workforce or work situation that works for them, the flexibility they may need with their family, the passions they may need that they're not seeing in big corporations. And I've actually coined this the second Me Too movement. When I go into my personal network, I see women with their experience in their careers and financial stability starting to look at what interest them and start businesses themselves. And so if you just put that all into what might happen on a larger scale as women get control of wealth, they'll direct it where it's important to them. They'll spend it how it matters. And they might start to do things of interest to them, which could be qualified as work or philanthropic efforts in a way that, they want to see the backdrop to how they do that, whether it's with flexibility, whether it's for a family, whether it's because of the cause, intertwined. And it's really exciting.
It's interesting when you talk about this transfer and the change that's occurring, because I think on the surface of it, it's like, oh, sure, there are more women going to have more wealth. So that's interesting. They'll have more control over that. But as you dig those layers deeper, and what I love you're expressing is, sure, there's going to be a shift in investment philosophy that'll be values related. They're potentially more long-term thinkers. You've got a secondary shift of philanthropy in that it may be driven towards more charities that matter more to women. So that could be one of the outcomes that occurs. And then that third piece of wanting to start businesses, having the capital to start businesses, but to set up a working environment the way they think a working environment would be set up best. Those are fundamental shifts across society. Like each of those things is a big deal, but collectively, that's a significant difference. It reminds me of, I was just thinking like Mackenzie Bezos versus Jeff Bezos. So Jeff Bezos goes and commissions this giant sailing yacht that can't land a helicopter on it. So he needs $100 and some odd million secondary vessel for all the toys that the helicopter can land on. That is, it in it of itself is actually technically a super yacht. And at the same time, Mackenzie Bezos gave away the equivalent value of those two vessels. She gave that money away in a philanthropic way.
Yeah. Well, I want to say, look, women won't just be beneficiaries of wealth if we're talking about that transfer. It's an opportunistic, they're going to be active participants in the opportunities it creates.
Right.
And I think, we might see some decision making that isn't materialistic inclined all of the time, because I think the statistics stay at least. But even if I say, where would my friends spend their time? And I think we've seen a shift away from materialism to experiences. And then from that, making a change in the world.
I think this is a Spider-Man quote. It's
then I won't know it.
Somebody in the comments will correct me if I'm wrong, please do. That with great power comes great responsibility. And I think in this case, with great wealth comes great responsibility. And I'm curious, as you have had conversations with women who have had either this transfer of wealth or had the transfer of wealth occur and are recognizing that level of responsibility, like what are the kinds of conversations that they're having about wealth?
Well, I think that responsibility world is the key. So let's extrapolate that a little bit. Let's put the baby boomer generation at the forefront of that. And likely the females have not been a participatory piece to the financial decision making. And therefore, if left, assets, regardless of whether they are investments or a building or a cottage, that seems like a very daunting experience, especially if it's not a conversation actively being had, which in many cases it's not. So that responsibility, first and foremost, needs to be respected as something they may not be prepared for. And the only way to prepare for them is to start to have that conversation as early as possible and provide a level of respectful education. women, it's not that they aren't able to learn this. They just, as I said, haven't been the ones brought into the conversation, and the
Yeah.
conversation hasn't been tailored to them. And
Right.
so there's a little bit of a gap there, knowledge, confidence, and experience that we need to fill. And with that responsibility, then again, to the next generation in children and starting it earlier.
Mm.
My experience is that, look, it is a learning curve. It is something that does feel daunting and overwhelming, and that they don't have a lot of places to look to for that experience. And so it's a great opportunity for someone like me to step in and really provide a framework to step through it. There are things they need to know to be able to make decisions on a day-to-day basis that I wouldn't be part of on a, spending or intersection with their wealth day to day. But overall, we can create a framework in which they can be empowered. And when I've seen that shift, it's life-changing. I see women who have gone through a divorce and then taken on that responsibility. I've seen women who have been widowed and take on that responsibility. And I come at it from empowerment. I want to inspire the potential they equally have to then take a controlling seat in that and make it what their life means to them.
So let's talk about that the next generation then. So the generation that the matriarch is worried about, right? That I'm going to hand all this wealth over to kids, and the concern that can come with that handover of wealth. What are the conversations that occur around wealth stewardship? Like what is that? Because that next generation, they didn't earn it. It got transferred, and now it's being inherited. And with that, again, comes responsibility towards that wealth. And then whether that a trust structure is in place and the wealth is sprinkled out over time or at a certain age, either way, there is this wealth coming forward. So when you have conversations with that generation, what are they concerned about?
Yeah, I think there's a term, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, right? And, if you haven't seen it been earned, you might have not instilled the values and seen the sacrifices and what
Right.
was required. And then you take advantage that it was always there. And there's, a lot of organizations that are trying to support the change in that for families and provide that level of education. What I see is an understanding that someone is probably wealthy or going to inherit. The first thing I think a parent has to think about is what motivation in itself might that destroy if given too early or in a magnitude that takes away someone's intrinsic drive.
Right.
So as a parent myself, intrinsic drive is what I'm working on, right?
Yeah.
How can I find your passion? How can I get you excited? It's not mine. I'm not going to do it. I joke. I'm the chauffeur, right?
Right.
There. So from that, there's a role of a parent in how they provide, some context, values of the family, and a balance to which I think kids are going to flourish if they have some accountability, obviously, on their own. But I think the kids, while under a lot of pressure, are quite responsive. I sat down with some children recently and we went through everything from compound interest to the fine print on a credit card. And no one taught them this, right? And I'm sure their parents tried and
Yeah.
No child listens, but to me, it was much more interesting. And with that, they take an active piece in saying, okay, yeah, I have a summer job. And the next email I got was, I'd like to put some money away because you showed me what $5 a day is going to amount to over my working life. And I can save that. That is reasonable.
Oh, that's so great.
It was. And I think, the parents become proud because it's something that instills what they want the kids to know and recognize they're going to have to learn. And back to that, the schools, unfortunately, just don't have a place to teach this to most schools and most students. But I always joke, because I teach this in some schools, you can pay attention for the next hour or you'll learn this the hard way.
Sure.
It's a life skill. And in that, you have an obligation to learn it, right? You have an obligation for your health. You're going to figure it out one way or another. You have an obligation with wealth. And so I think that pressure is kids are starting in some medium to understand that. And with that, they recognize then they need to learn it, but where they learn it is hard. And so again, another fortuitous place I can play a role and hopefully make a little bit of an impact.
Well, and as you say, right, like I think it's been coined that compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world, right? And for the younger that someone learns that and gets into the habit, I think it's both with philanthropy and with compound interest or investing, like the act of taking that money out every time I get a paycheck, because then I won't miss it, because it never really arrived. It just sort of went out and went into the investments and went into and any type of philanthropy that I want to do. And then as you make more and more, you just slowly increase those numbers. But small amounts compounding over a very long time have a crazy magnifying result. And I mean, you can jump on YouTube. If you're listening to this and you're a younger person and you're like, oh, I'm not investing, just jump on a YouTube and type in compound interest examples. And there's so many YouTubers that have done a great job of saying, hey, if you take $5 a day, as you said, which is $150 a month, right? And then you multiply that, it's $1,800 a year. But if you start there and then you slowly, even if you don't increase that amount, you'd be shocked at what that number is by the time that you're ready to retire. So I think I love, and you have I know you have a very deep background and are certified to support families in these types of decisions and these kind of conversations. So I love that you're getting an opportunity to talk to people as early as possible about things like compound interest and credit card debt and credit card interest rates and those sorts of things.
Well, those quick examples, we do one, we call her Sarah Saver. She's 17. She gets $1,000 on her 17th birthday. She puts $100 a month. And I think it's for like 10 years.
Yeah.
And then there's the next person who starts at 35 and the next person starts at 45.
Yeah.
She invested $13,000 and she's farther ahead than those two others that either triple the investment or, put much more away later on. And it's just that power. As Einstein, I think it was saying it was like the eighth wonder of the world. So
yeah.
Make it work for you, start early. And if you can add education along with it, for sure.
And is there a place like for women who are in this situation, like what's their opportunity to be in community with other women who are experiencing this? Are there communities that are starting to be built or formed where women that are getting this level of wealth that maybe don't have the experience of wealth stewardship and are it's sort of being put upon them? Are communities starting to form around this, or is it more of a one-to-one relationship that occurs with someone like you who is helping to guide them, or is it both?
Yeah, I think I want to first empower the women that might think about one day being in this situation or potentially are in it now, that they have the power, the willingness to go and ask for it.
Right.
Their advisors, their bank, their financial institutions, should be supporting them. There are people like me that it is just profoundly part of who I want to be and how I want to influence others. And there's many others that would provide that education alongside it. So they have to ask. If they're not asking, there are advisors that ultimately would deliver this kind of education and steward a plan and make sure that they feel financially responsible. I don't see so much of communities and groups, but I do start to see education-based providers starting to target an audience that might have not seen this previously.
And I guess, the earlier, as you say, the earlier you get this learning, the better, because obviously it's when the money is there, it's kind of like you could be in freeze mode, right? Because it's shown up and now I'm going to start my education about what to do with this, but it feels like the pressure is on, right? Because now you're responsible for this wealth. And so what I guess I'm getting from you is that, the earlier you start to educate yourself before you maybe have the role of wealth stewardship, maybe you have an influence on wealth stewardship, the better off they would be to learn early.
Sure. Like if you just think about, if you were starting to work and starting to learn this and the incrementalism, it's not a lot. It's a little drip, a little experience over time. And eventually, we're not asking people to learn everything I have and over 2 decades, but you can start to make educated decisions, have these frameworks and understand wealth accumulation, wealth and how it's going to grow for you, and eventually make plans. What are the goalposts? Where am I going to retire? What kind of money do I need to put away? Just on that note, there's only so much you are in control of, how much you spend, how much you save, how much you give away, which takes out the noise of a market, right? So you can kind of start to think about what your influence is over your wealth versus the tools you might be using to expand it over time, to grow it over time. So that piece really kind of is the forefront, I think, of what people need to think about.
That's beautiful. Catherine, I really appreciate you being on the podcast to have this conversation today. I've learned a ton in the time, and we'd already spoken about this and I learned more today. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks, Mike. It's always great to see you and have me on the podcast.